Hey guys, on this channel over the last few years, we've been pretty consistent at saying a number of things about this economy, agree or disagree with that. One of those issues has been the fact, in my mind, that Australia has been bought. At its core, what that means is the ultra wealthy keep getting richer at the expense of poor people. I want to say something about that. The narrative we always see in the media and social media and wherever is that young people are getting screwed. And that's not completely untrue. Yes, obviously, the young people are getting screwed with house prices, but it kind of hides the fact that we're all getting screwed. And today, I want to go back to a piece of data that I've shown before on the channel, I should say. However, I want to go back and have a little bit of a look at it because every time I see this bit of data, it leaves me thinking, wow, we're more screwed than what I thought we were before. I'm going to get into the data, go through it, and then I'm going to think what needs to happen at an individual level. I think at a country level and at a nation level, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think there's a trajectory. We're going the same way. That's not something we can control. What we can control is stuff at an individual level. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on. Okay, so we're looking at this graph now. What it is outright home ownership by demographic. So it's from the census from 2001 to 2021. So the first thing I'd like to say is that we're talking over 20 years here. We're talking over a couple of decades, and that trend has been continuing in the last 5 years. We can see people aged 55 from 64, the outright ownership, meaning they don't have any loans or anything like that on their house, went from 63.9% to 36.1%. The thing is with these declines, they're all constant declines. It's not as if it's a crash that's just happened in the pandemic period or a short-term period. We can see from 45 to 54-year-olds, that's gone from 38.8 to 15.2, and 17% to 5.4% from 35 to 44-year-olds. Okay, what do we take from this? Well, the obvious thing that I take from my mortgage broker perspective is that we are getting into more debt and we're staying in debt for longer. And this graph shows that this has been happening over a long period of time. I've done stuff before where I've shown that as women's participation in the workforce increased, then our debt started increasing as well. And it kind of makes sense. You're earning more household income, so now you can borrow more, and now you can go and spend more on houses. Unfortunately, what that does is it pushes up house prices for everyone. So that's cool for the guys that are earning the most amount of money, but it's not cool for the guys that are earning a lower amount of money because it pushes them to pay more for properties that they can't afford. It also says that when house prices are going up, then it's taking people longer to be able to prepare and save to get into a property, and we're seeing that the average first home buyer age in that 20-year period has probably gone up by around 10 years. I know it's around 37 at the moment. I always go on about that on this channel. Around that time, it might have been a bit less than 10 years. It might have been 30. I haven't looked up the data recently, but I could tell you with a high level of confidence that that's going to be about right, and it's going to demonstrate the trend. Interestingly enough, there is also a story about that 35 to 44-year-old bracket where it's gone from 17 to 5.4. It paints a picture of a time where people could get in debt at a really young age, and they only needed to work for not that many years before they were 44, and they could be debt-free. So it gives us a look into about where we were as a country versus where we are now. I'm going to talk about where we are now a little bit later on. I kind of get carried away about where we are now, and I think most of us broadly agree on where we are now, despite there being some differences on the details of that. But I think we all agree that it's not as good as what it was, put it that way. How are we getting poorer? Well, we're in debt. We're in more debt, and we're in debt for longer. That makes us harder to buy assets, right? It makes it harder for us to retire. And on top of that, we've got all of these other expenses that comes with living in 2025 that we have to deal with. If you look at wage growth versus asset prices, again, over the last 20 years, if you want, wages are going up slower than asset prices, which means we have to go in debt for longer and all of the stuff that I've talked about. There's a few different groups impacted by this. There's the young people, they're stuck between renting and increasing rents and being able to buy on a property and taking on the debt. Some of these people are struggling with increasing rents and saving for the deposit needed to get the debt. Having said that, governments have been doing stuff to help first home buyers get into the market. They've actually been doing things for the last 25 years, starting from the first homeowners grant. There is one thing I'll say about that, and that is that all of these schemes and grants and all of that sort of stuff, we have to acknowledge that that is actually contributing to more demand in the system. It's bringing demand forward because people wouldn't have been able to afford the deposit previously, sometimes many years of demand forward, and bringing it into this market. And that's creating a lot more demand than supply. That is what's been constantly happening for 20 odd years, 25 or so years, I should say. It is a gift, but it doesn't come without its risks. Again, I feel sorry for people who are stuck in this situation, but they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If you want to learn about some of those schemes and some of the ways governments are helping people to get into the market, and you do want to make 2026 your year because you're concerned about the rising rents and that you won't be able to get into the market, then you can find some links below and some information that could help you do that. The next group of people are middle-aged people with kids. People that are around my age, they've got a young family, they've taken on debt probably the last 5 years or so. Quite simply, they've taken on more debt than what previous generations had taken on. And they've got an issue about raising a family and the costs involved with that, and trying to be debt-free before retirement age. I guess kind of the older, maybe the 45 to 50-year-olds are kind of thinking, shit, how am I going to pay this debt off? There are simple ways, believe it or not, that you can turn a 30-year home loan into a 20-year home loan. You can find those all over the internet. I've created some resources in the links below for you to go and watch for free. If you trust me, they're things that I genuinely believe. It's not something like take on more debt and buy an investment property. Even though that can work, these are legitimate ways in which you can turn a 30-year loan into a 20-year loan. And I should say a normal person to turn a 30-year loan into a 20-year loan. So the next group are kind of the next older group, the 50-year-old. Sure, they've had a good run if they've owned a property 20 or 30 years, for 20 or 30 years, but they're not living without their challenges themselves. They've potentially got adult kids living at home, which are still either fully dependent or semi-dependent on them. By the way, that's what's keeping them in debt for longer. That's why you see that graph plummeting of 54 to 65-year-olds that own their house outright, because kids can't get out of the house. We don't live in a time where people leave home at 18 or 20 years old and go out into the world. If that was happening, that graph wouldn't look as bad because people would be able to focus on paying down debt. The challenge with that is that you're in debt for longer. I'm not a financial advisor. That is the stage of life I would argue you should be piling into assets if you need to save for your retirement. It is a stage of life where generally people are making the most amount of money because they have the most amount of experience. But what's happening is they should be getting richer at the quickest possible rate, but they're not. They're not getting richer at the quickest possible rate. And people have this argument to say that, well, you live in a good suburb because you bought there 20 or 30 years ago. That's not necessarily wealth. Like, that's not making them an income. Granted, they live in a good place, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have challenges and they're not victims of this environment that we all have to live through as well. So if you're one of those people, I would like to help. You can find my details in the links below. If you found this graph or this data useful, let us know, give us a subscribe. If you disagree, please comment. Please disagree respectfully here. I think the world is a better place when people can disagree respectfully and come together and talk about that. I think it's a bad place when, pardon the pun, we shoot each other down.